Hello, Brobs. We're back with one last chapter of Three Loves of Dostoevsky by Marc Slonim. Before we pause it, 9, Part 1, Chapter 9. In June 1856, Dostoevsky left Barnaul secretly for Kuznetsk, dreaming that the meeting with the woman who, to use his own expression, was rightfully his, would resolve all his doubts and difficulties. But instead of a joyful reunion, Kurnetz set the stage for a terrible fiasco. When he came into Maria's room, she did not throw herself on his neck. Instead, she broke into sobs and began kissing his hands, screaming that all was lost, that the marriage could not take place. She had to make a clean breast of everything. She had fallen in love with another, I told you. This successful rival, Nicholas Virgunov, a native of Irkutsk, who taught at a primary school, was a rather good-looking fellow of 24. Maria had become physically infatuated with him and was even thinking of marrying him. Fyodor clutched his head as he listened to her. When she had finished, he remarked that the time would come when Virgunov would reproach her for having been moved only by passion and ruining him. At first she was sure he was jealous, but then she grew thoughtful and started crying again. Now she no longer believed in any man's love. Vainly he tried during their long talk to get to the bottom of her real feelings and find out what her relations and Virgunov's were. This disjointed conversation most probably resembled the one he later gave in The Humiliated and Wronged to Vanya and Natasha. You don't respect him, don't even believe in his love, yet you're going to him irretrievably and are ruining everyone for his sake. What is this, then? He will harass you all life long, and you will do the same to him. Yes, I love him like a madwoman, she answered, paling as though from pain. I have never loved you so, Vanya, for I myself know I've gone out of my mind, and that I don't love him as one should. I love him in an evil way. Why, I knew this before, and even during our happiest moments had a premonition that he would give me nothing but torments. Instead of the solid suitor he had dreaded and whom Maria was ready to marry, out of practical considerations, Dostoevsky found in Kuznetsk a rival far more fortunate in love, but hardly any better off financially than himself. He had been apprehensive about a reenactment of the situation in Poor Folk, but in reality he was threatened by a situation out of White Nights, or even worse. Maria insisted on his meeting Virgunov. I met him. He cried in my room. However, that is all he can do, cry, Dostoevsky wrote bitterly to Wrangel. Perhaps his feelings toward his rival was the same as that of the hero of The Humiliated and Wronged. Toward Natasha's lover, he was weak, trusting, and timid of heart. He had no willpower whatsoever. To injure, to deceive him would have been a sin and a pity. To spare Virgunov's feelings, Dostoevsky concealed what he himself was going through and calmly discussed the chances of Maria's marriage to the young teacher. He had to weigh his words and resort to small wiles. I know the false position I was in, he wrote Wrangel, for if I were to begin advising them against it, the marriage, to represent the future to them, both would have said, he's looking out for himself, he's purposely inventing future horrors. But no matter what he might say to Maria, he understood very well that she felt she had unlimited power over Virgunov, while he himself was no more than her victim. She anticipated the delight of loving madly and torturing excruciatingly the one she loved, and that precisely because she loved, and for that reason, perhaps, hastened to give herself as a victim to him first. This description of Natasha in The Humiliated and Wronged is fully applicable to Maria and her attitude toward Virgunov, and no matter how strange it may seem, toward Dostoevsky as well. She was torturing both her lovers and, at the same time, undergoing torture on their account and finding a peculiar delight in this mixture of moral and erotic sadism and masochism, and this unwholesome and complex sensation called to and found a response in precisely the same tendencies in Dostoevsky. He felt crushed, racked, and the very keenness of his sufferings brought on a chilly rapture. The strain he was under, the strangeness of the circumstances, the tears and passion, the humiliation and desire, all these were blended into exhausting and vital sensation. Of the intensity of existence, at moments it seemed to him that he now loved her more than ever because of her own betrayal, because she had tortured and wronged him. He had an insuperable urge to give everything up for Maria's sake, to sacrifice his love to her new passion, to go away and not hinder her in arranging her life in whatever way she wanted. But when Maria saw that, instead of reproaching her, Dostoevsky was merely concerned about her future, she was as overwhelmed as Natasha, who tells Vanya, "You're a kind, honest man, and you don't say a word about yourself. Why, I was the first to leave you, yet you have forgiven everything. My happiness is the only thing you're thinking of." Perhaps because of this, Dostoevsky was not compelled to suffer long in the role of a martyr, for Maria refused to accept his voluntary sacrifice. "Don't cry, don't grieve," he quoted her as saying later. "All is not lost yet. There are just the two of us and no one else." At the most crucial moment, pity for Fyodor and a tender feeling for him flared up in her once more. She recalled the past, and her heart turned to me anew, was how he described the shift in her emotions. When he was least expecting it, she threw herself into his arms and recompensed him for everything he had gone through. "I don't know what the 2 days I passed through were like," he wrote Wrangel. "They were bliss and unbearable torture." Whether Dostoevsky transmitted his passion to her, whether she had swept away, whether she was swept away by a return of her old emotion, whether she was caught in the trap of her own intricate game, or simply did not want to give up her control of either man, no matter what the cost, the fact remains that she yielded to Fyodor, and he was able to inform Wrangel. I left toward the end of the second day completely hopeful. He stressed the word himself, but despite her proof of love, as he put it, he realized the difficulty of his position. His former illusions had crashed. Maria appeared before him in a new light, and instead of the former clarity, utter chaos now reigned in his soul. When, on his way back from Kuznetsk, his head cleared from the intoxication of his recent intimacy, he reflected that, according to the French proverb, the absent are always in the wrong. I am far away while he is with her. No matter how ardent Maria's recent kisses had been, he could not rely on her being faithful to him, for who could guarantee that after his departure she would not begin to vacillate and go back to the younger lover? She did. Hardly had he returned to Semipalatinsk and recovered to some extent after his physical and spiritual shock when a letter came from Maria. She was despondent, lachrymose, and repeated that she loved Virganov more than Fyodor. Worn out and thoroughly humiliated, he forgot all diplomacy and wrote, urging both her and Virganov to look at everything coolly and with common sense. Why, for them to live together and to marry, of all things, would be sheer madness. Maria let this pass in silence, but the teacher took offense and answered with coarse insinuations. This did not keep Dostoevsky from trying to help Virganov to better his condition, for after all, his rival might shortly marry Maria, and her welfare was the dearest thing on earth to him. He overcame his jealousy and resentment and quixotically offered himself as a sacrifice. He was, however, suffering unbearably because of his own magnanimity. The idea of a marriage of convenience for Maria had offended his moral sensibility, arousing his indignation against injustice, against the evil lot of the poor, but the idea that she was about to marry a pauper wounded his pride as a man, since he and Virganov were equally able or unable to support a family at present. Besides, the 24-year-old teacher could not expect anything but a miserly salary in the future. He had little education, and only a most insignificant career lay ahead of him, still in the same primary schools, whereas Dostoevsky was a writer. He had once attained recognition, and even now, during his lonely nights, had faith in his great calling. Therefore, Maria must have preferred Virganov solely out of love. The matter had to do with sentiment, pure and simple. Why did the woman he had chosen, to whom he had given his heart, refuse to share his faith? Oh, why could she not see that fame awaited him? Why had she not gambled on him? For there is no greater humiliation to a man than to realize that he is merely one of the herd to the woman he loves, and that she has read nothing prophetic on his brow. A very great deal in Dostoevsky's later life is explained by his resentment of this affront. It is rarely forgiven by anybody, even of modest talent. But for the time being, it was necessary to swallow his pride. He had no other choice. It is simply impossible for me to let her go. Under any circumstances, he explained the wrangle, love at my age is no whim. It has lasted for 2 years. You hear? For 2 years. During the 10 months of separation, it not only has not weakened, but has reached preposterousness. He no longer had the strength to master this preposterousness. Recollections of their intimacy, even though momentary, baited both his flesh and imagination. He was forever citing the proofs of her love as well as his rights to it. These searing recollections did not make things easier. Of course, everybody noticed that Dostoevsky had reached the end of his tether. In the early fall of 1856, he looked like a ghost during military drills and parades. Those who knew him best feared he would collapse. His nervous tension found release in an attack of epilepsy, after which he was ill for a whole week. Material cares were added to his physical and spiritual torments. His assistance to Maria, he was constantly sending her money, idiot, and the trip to see her had put him in debt to the tune of more than 1,000 rubles. There was no way of paying this off. Whichever way he turned, he ran into a high, inexorable wall. There was no way out, and all life seemed to him either a journey through the circles of a Dantean inferno or the unreal vision of a sick brain. And this, I predict, unless my work collapses and I can't go to it, will be the last chapter until March. Let us not forget about this guy. Stanley Neil Hench. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.